Felicia Olusanya, also known as Felispeaks, is a performance artist, poet, and writer whose work deals with issues of gender, sexualities, class, and race. Emmet Kirwan is a spoken word artist, playwright, and performer whose theatre is based specifically around themes of social class and social injustice. Both Felicia and Emmet have been at the forefront of building up working class culture in contemporary Ireland. Through individual interviews, each artist opens up discussion on their working process, ideas of exclusion and exclusion, the power of live performance, and community engagement. These interviews were realised by Clara Mallon of NUIG Galway and Dr Salomé Paul of Trinity College Dublin as part of a wider project that celebrates the working class culture in Ireland. These interviews were conducted with the kind support of the Canon and Curriculum programme at National University Ireland Galway, with special thanks to Dr Ciara Murphy and Professor Patrick Lonergan for their support and guidance during this process.
Great. So, Felispeaks, thanks so much for joining us here today. We are delighted to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
We are going to start off by asking you just some basic general questions, if that's okay. And the first one's incredibly general, and it's just, can you tell us a bit about yourself and how you got into the arts in Ireland?
So, as you mentioned, my name is Felicia. I go by the stage name Felispeaks. I'm a performer and a spoken word artist. And how I got into the arts in Ireland, I suppose I just went for it mainly without realizing that I was going for it. You know, I wasn't going for the arts in Ireland. I was going for expression. I was going for exploring self. And I was going for learning how to use my voice. And that happened in university. I went to Maynooth University, which was amazing. Studied English and sociology. And I remember in second year, sociology, English and sociology, there was this competition. It was like an open mic slam thingy, the Literary Society organized, which was really incredibly generous of them. And I remember one of my English lecturers was a judge, mortal. But I did not win anything that year. I came honorary fourth because I think they slightly felt sorry for me, but also he kind of spoke to me afterwards. He was like, "Oh, you're really good. You just keep writing." And I was like, "Okay, whatever." The following year, I came back and I did the competition again, and I came first. And I got to represent Maynooth University, and I think that was it was a really nice moment. It was a push for me, and I didn't even actually think about it as a possibility beyond just looking for joy. You know, I didn't think about it beyond enjoying just what comes out of myself and the community around it. So yeah, that's how I got into the arts in Ireland.
Great. Well, my next question is more generally about the arts in Ireland, and you know, the arts in this country in many ways can be precarious as a job. You know, it's an incredibly difficult landscape to survive in many ways. And I would argue that it's kind of designed more so for those from a more privileged background or those with expendable income. So, you know, on that vein, how, as a woman from a working class background, how have you found navigating that landscape?
Truth be told, it's been challenging in a lot of ways. More because it's a landscape that I had never had preview to. So it's only now as an adult that like is, you know, in toddler years in my profession that I'm kind of seeing other people as that are my peers, you know, say things like, "Oh yeah, you know, I started doing this when I was 12," and I'm like, "What?" Or I went to dance school. I'm like, who does that? Like, or like it seems like they had even if they weren't given the job, quote unquote, but it seems like they had a long history and experience, and they had the opportunity to have that space to experience that way before I even thought it was possible to even do a job in it, so I think it's been challenging in ways because I feel like I'm constantly learning something new, and not that I'm trying to learn it all in one go, but when you mentioned precarious, I thought it wasn't precarious for me in terms of like finding work. It feels more precarious for me in terms of like navigating what to do in the space after I do the job, because I think what I've found out really quickly is my job as an artist doesn't begin and end on a page and a stage, and actually having to physically be in these different spaces with different dynamics that I suppose wasn't introduced to early, has been challenging because they're constantly new. So yeah, I suppose that's the fairest way to explain it.
Yeah, and I'm sure like even since like COVID-19, it's a new navigation in itself as well. It's a new landscape in the arts that we're finding ourselves in, you know.
Mhm,
Um
absolutely.
yeah, being completely cut off from the usual platforms. Um the next question I have is this idea of art as activism. And up until very recently, you hadn't considered yourself an artist activist, but that has recently changed. And I'm wondering, could you talk a bit about that transition from artist to artist activist and how that changed for you?
What's interesting is I wouldn't even necessarily call myself an art activist or an activist. um, yeah, I didn't. I was informed that I was when I started to loudly care about social issues that were considered controversial. Because I don't think as an artist you get called an activist if you're championing causes that most people just think are normal and are okay. For some reason, I don't know. I just don't. When I was championing women's rights, I don't think I was called an activist. When I was performing for our mothers, or Who Will March for Us, actually, yeah, it was Who Will March for Us. When I was performing that piece during the referendum and during the time of the referendum, I wasn't called an activist. I was called perhaps an important voice in that moment, which I am incredibly grateful for, and really surprised I got the opportunity to be part of. But during that time, which was really politically charged, I wasn't called an activist, but I only started being called an activist when I spoke about Blackness and Black issues. And I think there's something to say about that dynamic. And there's something to say about recognizing and realizing those differences feeds into not being comfortable accepting the title, because it's less really activist. It's more Black person, social justice person. It's more a specific thing that they're trying to say. And suppose I'm not necessarily of rejecting the term in its original intention, but in how it's being used and placed on me, I tend to quite push against it because of those nuances. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
makes sense.
absolutely. And, I think that that's a really interesting point that you've made, that, you you've always kind of represented through your work issues, you know, social justice issues, and issues about inequality and women's rights, as you say. But it's only up until recently that you've kind of gained this status as an artist activist. But even looking back at your earlier work, you're still in some ways, and your work is still in some ways looking into those underrepresented voices in Ireland.
Absolutely. I think mainly because, like most artists, a lot of our art is born of self first. And I think it's important, if you're trying to honor a topic or an issue that is worth listening, that you honor yourself through how you speak about it as well. And just because you can't, I don't think there's many ways you can detach the artist from the art. That when I'm speaking about women's issues, even if I haven't had this particular woman issue that I'm speaking about, that I care deeply about womanness or womanity to represent that underrepresented voice. So I suppose within the subcategories that I personally identify as, like a Black woman or queer woman, so with, yeah, and just woman in general, and slightly masculine and slightly maybe sort of non-binary, like all those niches and differences, I try to not just empower myself, but obviously empower those voices within my poetry, whether I can relate to them specifically or not.
Okay. And so because your spoken words, as well as the rest of your work, is incredibly performative and theatrical. And when you perform, usually you perform under the name Felispeaks, sorry. And so I was wondering, what was the relation that you, Felicia, have with Felispeaks? Is she an extension of yourself, or is she totally different from you?
Good question. so I named the performative part of myself Felispeaks because Felicia was just not the one. Like, she just wasn't speaking clearly. Even right now, like, it's really awkward. Whereas Felispeaks on stage is really fantastic. She's really confident. She can look strangers in the eye. She can free flow. She can mock you and make you love you. Like, all these things. It feels like Felispeaks is fueled by the energy in the room as well. But I think I named this performative aspect of myself that I only that felt really like unseen. I felt like I hid her a lot, and I needed her to be on stage, and I needed her to express what Felicia thinks in a beautiful way and in a charismatic way, without Felicia feeling too naked, too open. And I suppose having a different name to flow under gives you a different kind of courage, even if you're the same person or even if you're wearing the same face. Yeah. She's my Sasha Fierce.
No, but that's really interesting, because that really puts forward your performing side as an artist, and you have so many faces as an artist, because you describe yourself as a poet, as a playwright, as a performer, and it's such an interesting combination of artistic skills. And could you tell us a bit about your relation to that combination, to combining playwriting with poetry, with performing?
I think I'm a greedy artist, and what that means is that everything that I like, I want to do, and everything that I could be possibly good at, I want to expand. And so even right now, and thanks to some bursaries, I'm trying to get my claws into understanding how to like direct poetry and film and theater and music. And it's like, girl, you don't know anything about film. You don't know anything about music beyond holding a note, but I like these things. And I think giving myself the brand name or the Sasha Fierce umbrella thing to hide under means that all these things that I like get pushed under this category of person. And also, yeah, like when you mentioned the pandemic, that really disrupted my general flow of things, because I could be quite Felicia at home and literally, even if it's quite hard, because I'm constantly thinking about art in some capacity, but I can switch off Felispeaks and be just like, I'm chatting shit for the rest of the evening, I'm drinking wine. And so having that routine where Felispeaks gets to go to a place to be, and having it that vastly diminished and housing them both in the same space, Felicia and Felispeaks, was just so jarring because I couldn't turn off. And even now, it's getting better and trying to separate these mental spaces. But yeah, when they're all in the same person, you're like, I have things to do. Like, my mom wants to talk to me because I'm at home, and that's Felicia. But like, I have a Zoom meeting in an hour, and it takes me 2 hours to decompress. What is that? You know?
Totally get that.
Yeah, me too. I think a lot of women can relate to that.
Yeah, like, tired.
But yeah, and when we were researching your work, actually, we were really surprised to see that even your spoken word, even your poetry is really theatrical, really performative. Like you really embody the role you have written in your poetry, and we were thinking like some poets definitely write for the page, but you seem to write for the stage too. And so we were wondering, have you always worked with performance in mind, even when it comes to poetry?
Oh, I think the answer is yes. I think I write with performance in mind a lot. There's very few poems that I write that feel alive on page for me. Um, Most of my poems need to come alive in my voice or in my body. And so even while I'm writing, most of the time I'm saying the lines out loud, every couple of lines to see if the rhythm feels right, if I'm saying all the things I want to say, the way I want to say it, literally, just because I think words have the deceitful nature of looking different to how they sound on paper. And even if you're reading it in your head, just a different energy when you read it out loud. So generally, I write definitely with performance in mind. Sometimes I start doing moves, and sometimes even without picking up a pen, if like I'm itching with like an idea or a piece in mind, it usually is already in performance. So I'm trying to then replicate that performance in my head into words. How can I capture this energy, this feeling, this motion, this emotion in my body? Literally, it could be that I can't stop vibrating with a specific feeling, but the only thing is that I'm vibrating. Now I have to translate this vibrating feeling into 3 stanzas. What does that even mean? Um, so I generally take my body and my vocal performance into account a lot.
Okay. And so basically you really try to embody your creative process. And is that something that you share with the people attending your workshop? Because we've noticed that you're really involved with communities, especially in form of workshop to writing for performance. So could you talk to us a bit about these initiatives and your role in it?
Yes, I quite enjoy. You know what? I always think I'm not gonna have fun. Yeah, let me just be honest, because I just like doing the writing and stage thing. I'm very much that artist, but I've discovered through the lovely and gentle, generous pushes of art centers and art institutions that I like workshops a lot. I never like them thinking about them. So every time I get into a meeting about a workshop, they'll probably tell you I'm always like, yeah, it's gonna be grand. Stop talking to me about it. Like my face is like, okay. But as soon as I'm in there, it is the most joyous occasion just because um I I like to not think of it like I'm necessarily teaching, but that we are sharing an experience. And I suppose the first few kind of workshops that I've done, I'd say I'd learned on the job, because I'm okay with free falling on my face in front of people. Like, we're all learning anyway. But with workshops and working with communities, I think it's really imperative to my art, because if I say that I write about people, I must know the people, I must meet the people, and subsequently I must feel their pains and their stories. Not necessarily pains, because don't be a sadist of a poet, Felicia, but their stories. I like to feel their stories. And in terms of what I share in these workshops, I do share a lot about the physicality and the physical parts of writing for performance, just because I just try and tell as much of the truth as possible. And this is one of the things I do say in workshops. I'm like, tell the truth on paper. So I suppose I tell them all the things I say to myself in the mirror when I'm struggling to write. I've also gotten a lot of unsuspecting workshoppers into meditation. I've gotten it in order to write and to feel the emotions that they're trying to process on paper. And it's been quite just glorious, because one, knowing the instinct to try something out in a workshop that you probably haven't ever seen on any other body but yourself, and hoping to God it flipping works. And so the joy of some of those workshops has been that they worked. And I've been like, wow, God.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you so much. Okay, so thanks so much for joining us, Emmet. We've been looking forward to talking to you all week.
Thanks for having me.
I know that in the past you publicly stated that Ciara was the last uncensored space to prompt political discussion about the current issues in the Irish society. Could you talk about your conception of Ciara as an uncensored political space?
Yeah, so when This Is Pop Baby wanted to do a celebration of the 1916 uprising, it was a kind of a counter celebration from the official celebrations that were going on. So a lot of artists at that particular time, we felt that with things like The Gathering and the 2016 celebration, and then even things like Creative Ireland, a lot of the language around it was like, it was essentially, and I know because I do voiceovers for advertising companies, it was like an advertising remit where artists were being co-opted to sell the message of austerity towards the world. Ireland has gone through recession, we've had a bank bailout, but we're still here and we're still open for business. And look at all this lovely art that we have. So This Is Pop Baby said, well, let's make a show that's a huge kind of circus spectacular that also has an explicit political message and political dimension. So if you could call it like Panty Bliss's aspect of that was queer radicalism, ideas around identity, around gender, around, and what I'm quoting them, they would say gender fuckery, how we can actually change our views about what it is to be Irish. And Heartbreak was a poem that I wrote for that play, and it was part of 4 poems, each of them dealing with a different aspect of where we were in 2016. And I wrote Heartbreak in response to a number of different things. It necessarily wasn't. It's about a man coming to the idea that he's a feminist later in his life and saying, oh, well, actually, through the knowledge that get like from my partner and how she feels and about things that happened to her, but also there was around the housing crisis an incredible negative narrative from some journalists who seem to be picking on female housing activists. And I felt that some of this was not only misogynist, but was classist. And they went on the Late Late Show. There was a few young women, and there was a lot of stuff about like, well, why should we give her a house and why should she get this? So I kind of thought to myself, and this is what I was saying about art, if films like Rosie did this as well, essentially if the story can be given a narrative, people often create kind of folk devils and they moralize around poor people in receipt of money. And there's a real vein of classism in this country that has never been dealt with and still is not being dealt with. And it's just simply being ignored because people simply say, well, Ireland doesn't have a class system. and which is a way of just never having to actually deal with the inherent problems that that brings up. So I wrote Heartbreak as a response to that, as a response to, there was a Trinity academic who was quite forceful in his opinions about this young woman on the Late Late Show. And I kind of was just like, right, this is going to be something that will encapsulate her struggle and the struggle of the women that I know or have known growing up in my family and all these things collectively. So to get onto, that was a long-winded way of getting to this point. What I said was, in one of the original poetry pieces, I said, theatre is the last analog space because it can't be digitized. Now, actually, since then, it is being digitized because of COVID. Cameras are coming in and so forth. But essentially, when you said something on a stage, in a poem or a performance, in a play, the doors were closed and it was literally only for the people that were in that room. So the idea could be disseminated to them, but it was all analog. They had to hear it, remember it, and then take it out into the world, if you will. And that was the thing about Heartbreak, was why I filmed it, because I wanted it to go beyond the walls of the theatre. But one of the things about defamation laws in Ireland, and there has been plays all the way through the 20th century that have been stopped, because I think it's the Rose Theatre, a condom was produced on stage and the theatre was shut down. That's a different Ireland. But there has been other musicals, I can't remember the exact name, that was shut down by solicitors' letters. But sometimes if you're smart enough and there's a story that you want to tell, you will get away with telling it on stage a lot easier than you could about getting it on the national stage in the Abbey or any other major theatre, because all of them are in receipt of government funding. So there's kind of put it this way, controversial. I don't want to say something that's too controversial, but let's say some of the aspects of Ireland in the last 10 years that have been incredibly controversial around An Garda Síochána, for example, or around the banking crisis, or around a multitude of other things that has happened. It's very, very hard to get something that is a story or a dramatized version of those scandals on national television. It just wouldn't happen. It's very hard to get stories made into a radio play on the national broadcast or even news talk. That wouldn't happen. You might get away with it in a novel, but not really. So that's what I meant by theatre being an analog space where these ideas can foment and they can be disseminated to the audience, and there's not usually that much blowback. But I hope that answers the question. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, definitely. And you mentioned the idea of disseminating ideas through Ciara, and so we were struck by the fact that your work really focus on working class lives. And so it seems to disseminate that idea that class system actually exists in Ireland, even though Ireland doesn't want to acknowledge that. And so we were wondering what inspired you in the first place to write about working class lives?
I suppose it's just from a theatre view, there has always been a strong working class voice, and that kind of went away in the mid 20th century after the kind of creation of after the Gaelic revival and all the brilliant plays that were being performed continuously in the Abbey in the early part of the 20th century. But in the 1980s and 90s, there was more kind of working class artists coming up, and then in the 1990s, with increased funding and increased free tour level education, essentially, you had more working class people from working class areas going into the arts and coming out, and often there was a look backwards at working class culture. And when I say that, I mean that broadly. I don't mean a very specific area of Dublin. I mean, as I'm talking about class consciousness here, that transcends, that's intersectional, that transcends its place and covers the entire country and Irishness as a whole. And it's something that's constantly changing. And the idea that it's constantly changing, who or what it is constantly changing and is only right. So, but what I would see specifically was representations that I didn't feel rang true to not just to my own experience, but I didn't think, I often felt that in rehearsal rooms, there was people dismissing the idea of Ireland having a class system, but they seemed absolutely obsessed with writing plays and characters from working class backgrounds. And at the same time saying, well, we don't have a class system. I was like, well, why did you write about two characters from the North Inner City? You know what I mean? Like, so, and a lot of the time as well, the representations of working class, and this is specifically for my work, the representations of working class Dubliners was often a form of working class buffoonery. There was a, working class comic relief. These characters were portrayed. This happens all the time with any kind of different group that is that's marginalized. It happens in Irish theatre with travellers and stuff. They imbue them with magical kind of powers, or then all these kind of misrepresentations of different social groups. And they were doing it a lot, I felt, with kind of working class characters. They just didn't ring true. They were either the criminal, they were the heroin addict, they were, that changed, I think, with companies like Passion Machine in the 1980s, who were doing brilliant work. And then loads of great companies like Macarow and Fishamble started to produce loads of brilliant plays. And I think Barabbas, and there's a number of other Irish companies that were really kind of investigating this. Another great one now is Broken Talkers, who they do the best kind of work around. I don't think they would particularly think it's class consciousness, but they're specifically telling stories of people who are marginalized and giving them the powers and the tools to tell their stories. So inspired by people like Phelan Canon and Gary, who run Broken Talkers, I would have been inspired to go, okay, well, I think I can write a story and I think it can be correct, and I would like this representation to be on stage alongside all of the others,
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. So that's the end of the public interview, and now we will ask you some question specifically about your work, and I will start with, of course, Dublin Old School, which I actually read before seeing it the first year I was in Dublin, and to be honest, reading it was really hard because it was my first year in Ireland, so my English wasn't that good, and I think it's not a play which is meant to be read, but to be watched. So the first time I read it, I was like, it doesn't make any sense, but seeing it was great.
Did you see the staged version?
I saw the recorded version, unfortunately.
Great, yeah, nice one, yeah.
But I really enjoyed it, and I now understand the incredible good reception it got at the time by both critics and the audiences, and besides this public success, it has toured a lot. It won many awards, and so my first question is, what inspired you to create Dublin Old School?
I suppose there was a number of things, professionally, what I was talking about earlier, like I trained as a theatre actor, and my life has been in the theatre for the last 20 years. And I've worked here and in London, and I'd spent a lot of time honing that craft and enjoying it, and I was doing a lot of plays, and with the same actors a lot of the time as well, in Ireland and in England, where they were often lavish kind of new productions of old plays from 100 years ago. And when I went to college, I submerged myself in all modern Irish writing and Irish plays. So I loved Marina Carr, and I loved Colin McPherson and Mark O'Rowe and Enda Walsh, and basically anything I could get my hands on that was Gary Mitchell, for example. I loved Gary Mitchell, and I loved Gary Mitchell's representations of loyalist working class communities and how kind of precise and in-depth they were. So they were the plays that I read, but for some reason plays like that were not being produced when I came out of college. I don't know why. I'm not, like, they were being produced in other places. So to get a new play on that was contemporary and vibrant and of the time was kind of few and far between. So myself and Ian Lloyd Anderson, who had worked on, actually, there's the poster there, Alice in Thunderland. I don't know if you can see that at home. So that's Alice in Wonderland. That's that's Street in the Opera and Major Barber. So they're just a few of the productions I've been in. All the rest are in the back in the other room, you know. So again, that's Philip McMahon, who I was talking about earlier, you know, who wrote Alice in Wonderland, and that starred Sarah Green, who's also in Dublin Old School, the film. And that was a brilliant kind of like massive explosion of energy and contemporary writing and contemporary music and young actors on the stage of the Abbey. And it was really revolutionary for the Abbey to do, because it brought up lots of different themes, put a few people's noses out of joint. I remember a woman actually walking out, because I stood in the wings of the auditorium for an entrance, and I seen a woman coming out and going, I don't know what that play is, and I don't care, and it shouldn't be on the main stage of the National Theatre. So this is what you're up against a lot of the time, you know. People think the theatre is a very middle-class pursuit. Certain ideas should be said and talked about. Things shouldn't be political, as we said earlier. They want nice plays with nice costumes, nice designs, nothing that will ruffle feathers. So Philip McMahon and Jenny Jennings, who run that company, and Ray Scannell, is also another brilliant, working class writer from Cork, who, you know, makes incredible theatre. I was like, okay, this is what I want to do. So the next play myself and Ian did together was Major Barber, which was brilliant. Claire Young, who is also another working class artist, who's just done a new movie called Herself, and she's written that, and it's brilliant, and it's on Amazon at the moment, and that's brilliant. Another representation of kind of like working class life for a woman in a terrible situation and domestic violence. So that's what I mean about all these kind of great kind of working class artists, you know, all working together. It wouldn't have been like that necessarily in the 50s. It would have been very kind of middle class and different pursuit. But there's a whole generation of people coming up and out. But there was not a lot of parts that represented who we were, where we were from, and so forth. So I remember we were in the dressing room with Major Barber, and I said I loved Major Barber, I loved Bernard Shaw, I loved being in it, but I do like contemporary pieces. So he said to Ian, I said, the next play that we do together, I said, I'm going to write it. It's going to be contemporary, it's going to be fast, and it's going to be fun. And I goes, I want you to be in it. And I had an idea popping around my head for a play based on an incident that happened to me. The play is not true to life, but it's extrapolated from a singular incident of meeting my brother, and what would have happened in an alternate reality. And so the play itself is a kind of science fiction play rooted in a kind of Dublin family drama around addiction and homelessness, and all of those kind of aspects. Like, I suppose there's all the science fiction books there, and there's the plays, and there's the history books. So it's kind of it's a play that's set in a causality loop, and there's a whole lot of other mad stuff goes on in it. But mainly it's about two brothers, and it's all done through the opening 15 minutes is done through rap, and then the rest of it's done through verse, or what people would call spoken word, and then there's also regular stuff in it. But I just wanted to write something that was fun, and as well, if you've seen it in the opening minutes, I wanted something that assaulted the senses, because for a lot of the time in the 1990s, there was a lot of monologue plays, which I loved. They were great storytelling plays, but they were often just an actor standing in a pool of light reciting something to the audience, which is what Irish people do quite well. I wanted something that blasted out of the gate and gave people 15 minutes of rap, and even if they couldn't comprehend it, they'd kind of get the gist of it. And also, what I trained in a thing in college called Meyerhold and Lecoq movement, which is all about biomechanical movements on stage. So I wanted it to be kind of like a live action cartoon in how they reacted to each other. So it's very theatrical, very physical, and the whole thing was kind of was trying to be a feat of physical and lyrical athleticism that all took place in an hour and 10 minutes. And so the people will go, Jesus, how did they do that? Said she wanted to put all that training that we'd done in college to use. And then when we get out of college, we never asked to do anything with it, you know. Like Major Barber just stand there on stage in a costume, you know. So that's the thing. We as artists were trained in college for a contemporary theatre that when we came out into that contemporary theatre wasn't being practiced. So that was one of the main reasons as well for writing Dublin Old School.
Okay, thank you very much. And as you mentioned, one of the main topic of Dublin Old School is drug use in working class communities.
Yeah.
And you point out in the play a really interesting contradiction. While one of the brother, Daniel, so his drug consumption is socially acceptable, the others, Jason, is completely demonized. Could you tell us a bit about that contradiction and why you addressed it in your play?
Yeah, I suppose it's strange, you know, there's politicians will also engage in a form of kind of moral relativism when it comes to things like legislation, legality and law breaking. But everybody knows, you know, legality and morality don't necessarily always correlate. There's a lot of things you could do that aren't particularly nice, but you're not going to get arrested for it. But there seemed always to be a moral certitude when it came to addiction and it came to drugs. And I think it's a generational one, because the ubiquitous nature of drugs really only came in the 70s and 80s. And if you're a person who had your formative years prior to those decades, your attitudes towards drugs would be very, very different. So a lot of people in the media, and I'm not slagging them, but like, if you ever heard the Joe Duffy show, you know, the conversation around it, or these kind of like nighttime shows and stuff like that, radio call-in shows, people's attitude towards drugs and drug takers, very, not just moralistic, but incredibly linear, binary. Drugs are bad. Drugs are wrong. Even though themselves, you're taking some form of pharmacological support, or I don't know if that's the right word. Don't quote me on that. So I often kind of just found that funny, you know, that like, this drug is good, this drug is bad. And I remember someone saying, they say, but drugs are bad. I said, but drugs don't have cognitive reasoning. They're not humans. They don't understand emotions. They don't make decisions. They can't be bad. They're an inanimate object. And the idea as well that people's lives could be ruined because of drugs, or even a small amount of drugs, always just blew my mind. And I do know that the legislation in the 1970s to ban drugs was only meant as a temporary short stopgap. It wasn't supposed to be on the books for as long as it has been. But there's an inability and a lack of drive to sort out these problems, because again, they are problems that primarily proliferate in areas of social deprivation, and they do not affect people who are in the, whatever you want to call it, the contented classes, or never come across it. And if you don't, like, I live in a town now outside of Dublin, I don't see any social problems because it's a small town. So if you live in a town like this, for as far as you're concerned, Ireland doesn't have any social problems. So why would you bother, you know what I mean, caring about whether or not there's a proper drug rehabilitation programs going on, and maybe drug decriminalization programs that need to happen. So what was happening was, in Ireland, many middle class people and people of means were taking expensive drugs, but then getting up and going to work on a Monday, but then decrying the fact that heroin addicts, or people that were taking drugs that destroyed your entire life, and crack, crystal meth, heroin, they are not necessarily that they basically make you forget who you are. They destroy who you are completely and utterly. And alcohol can do that as well. It's not that you go into a state of, oh, I didn't know what I was doing. It actually destroys who you are as a person, because who you are as a person is how you conduct yourself in your life, how you choose to engage with other people and not do something crazy. These are the things that you're taught by your community when you're socialized and by your family. And what happens is drugs can just wipe all that out. And there's many people that take drugs that don't wipe that aspect of themselves out. They just keep them within the borders of acceptable behavior. And then there's a moralizing that happens. And I just thought that hypocrisy was something that was interesting to put into the hearts of the two brothers. One being a homeless heroin addict, the other, and I just used ketamine just because it was analogous to kind of heroin, as it was it was an opioid, and it was something that can be not as addictive as heroin, but something that puts you into an other state. So there's an othering that he goes through as well. That's chemical toxicity that he goes into and becomes some other kind of person. And the two of them having that kind of moral chat. I know George Bernard Shaw does it, but just that kind of argument. But peeling all of that away, there's actually a lot more familial pain and angst, and family scars are the ones that actually scar you the most. And also, it doesn't do it in the play, but it offers up those questions like, well, why these two young men? Why these two young men from this area that was swamped with drugs in the 1990s? Even though, and he goes to great lengths and great pains to say in the play that both of their parents were incredibly moral and hardworking. Not moral, but like, any bastions and but just they knew right from wrong, and they taught that to their two boys. And that kind of conversation was something that I thought would be interesting to put on a stage, and rap, and spoken words, and dancing,
Yeah, and about that, about mingling different form of arts in that piece of work. In doing that, it kind of appealed to new audiences, to people who usually didn't go to theater. And so my last question would be, could you talk a bit about expanding audiences in theater, making theater a more inclusive space?
Yeah, well, it's that thing. It's about, like, you're making a more inclusive space by writing more kind of inclusive stories, just straight off the bat, before we go back into old school and what we did with that. So it's important to tell stories. Like, so Rosie McDonough is a writer from the traveling community, who's writing great works. Like, those stories only happen if you empower people from different communities that feel maybe marginalized, not feel maybe they are marginalized from these spaces. Not a lot of the time, because it's an active marginalization. But theaters can be kind of like monoliths that people feel that they don't belong in. Museums, art galleries, because they are and have been targeted towards people of means. And it does happen to you when you're a teenager. Maybe, like, you look different, that kind of way, and you walk into a building and some security guard comes over and goes, "You're not supposed to be here, get out." So it's about kind of making spaces and artistic spaces, places that are open, that are for the people, because art is for everybody. And only when we tell everybody that this is not only our national theatre, it's your national theatre, this is your national gallery, this is your local art space. And I do think there's a lot of great community-based arts groups all over the country, in every village and town, that are doing that. And you get like I know Rusangano family came from a similar kind of group that was happening down where they are. I think they're in Letterkenny, and you get, so that's great. Now you get to hear their voice and their song and their sound. So it's about opening up and making it intersectional so everybody can come in and be part of that story. But also, the story, like the thing about theatre is, and stories that are on stages, it's incredibly limited in the amount of number of people that can get in. So it's about, what usually happens is, Ireland's great for putting on new plays by new writers, but then not putting them back on again. And I know there's a cost prohibitive kind of aspect to that. And there's a number of things. I won't keep us too long on it. This is my idea for it. It's a lot of it has to do with advertising. A lot of the time, posters for new plays are put up around town, and the posters are so abstract and nobody knows what it is, where it's going on, and what's it about. The picture looks beautifully from a design point of view, but it doesn't tell people this is a play, it's about this, and we think you would enjoy it because we think you would like something like this. And the same way they do films. That's one thing. Putting plays on and bringing them back multiple times so they can build an audience. And then once, I think the figure is, I was talking to a producer about this recently, the audience, I think in Dublin and Ireland for theatre is around 40,000 people. So once you reach that 40,000 people, that's it. They're the people that go to the theatre. Then you have to move into a new audience demographic of people that don't go to the theatre or used to go to the theatre, like my mom and dad in the 1960s and 70s, and then with video and television and Netflix and everything like that comes along, stops it. So what happened with Old School was, very luckily, it went from Bewley's Cafe and then got a deluxe production, if you will, from Project Art Centre, and Cian O'Brien and Claire, I can't remember Claire's again. Anyway, I'm thinking of the producers here now. But anyway, they brought the show and gave it this kind of like huge production, lights by Sarah Drain, Drummy, and Philip came back and directed, and we made a huge kind of show that was much bigger. So that's a run for 2 weeks, and then it would come back then a year later for another 2 weeks, and then the next year for another 2 weeks. And actually what we started to find was we had expended all of the regular theatre crowd, and then the show started to shift into another realm of people that had never, one, been inside any theatre. Once we ran it in Tala, we got an audience of people that had never been to the theatre ever, young people in their 20s. And then a whole new audience came to the project who didn't know where it was. So they had to keep ringing the box office to ask for directions. So we knew we'd kind of gone into another realm. So my kind of goal now is, and has been, and I remember saying this to Jerry Stembridge when I was like 19, all these kind of ideas was like, tell you what I'm going to do. I want people from my community to cook it, whatever. And so now what I'm trying to do is, and what I've always been planning to do, is to spread theatre into a place, because I think it's vital. I think there's stories that you won't get on television, you won't get on radio, you're not going to see in your broadsheets. You're not even sometimes going to read them in a book, because there are certain stories that can only be told on stage in a theatrical fashion, which is incredibly invigorating, is incredibly inspiring. And the physical and vocal nature of seeing actors interact on stage in a way, and I'm talking, this isn't the work I do, I'm talking about all plays and all actors and companies out there. I think it's stuff that will really blow people's minds. And I think because you don't have to access it through a screen, it's a break from that quotidian doom scrolling constant kind of thing where there's no screens for an hour or two, you're in a dark space in a communal grouping of people. And that has a transformative transformative quality to it, that you go in one person, you come out another, and you can only get that sometimes through a play. So all of the plays that I'm writing or hoping to write are going to be about that, like that, and I'm aiming them specifically at people that don't usually go to the theatre, and I want to get them into the theatre because I believe that it's a vibrant, necessary art form that cannot be allowed to die. And I think that it needs to be diverse voices. We need new plays from, as I said, from the traveling community, new plays from young Black writers, new plays from young Irish writers who are of Asian heritage. You know, there's like a lot of young people whose parents are Polish in this country. I'd love to see a play, you know, based on their experience. I want to see all of these things, because at the moment we just keep delving back into the canon, trying to figure out who we are by investigating texts and plays that were written 100 years ago and are about people that are long dead. And it will teach us some things, like, you know, the universality of always plays like Shakespeare have always got something to teach us. And you know, all of the greats have something to teach us. But I think there needs to be a 50-50. It can't be 80% old. I've said this before, old dead white men plays. You need new, vibrant plays by new writers, and some of them would be like Stacey Gregg, Nancy Harris, Ursula Ranley Sarma. You know, I could go on. Noelle Brown is great, yeah, as well. Broken Talkers, loads of brilliant, vibrant theatre, you know.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, listen, thanks so much for your time.
Nice,
Thank you
thanks,
very
lads.
much.
Cheers. Have a good one.
Mind
Bye-bye.
yourself.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
If you enjoyed this interview and would like to hear more about it, you can browse our YouTube channel for webinars, performances, and podcasts performed and presented as part of our series. You can also access our Festival of New Work website at the link in the description. This project is generously funded by the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education and supported by the National University of Ireland, Galway.